The rhythmic hum of the lawnmower vibrated through Malik Johnson's hands as he guided it steadily across his front yard. The rich scent of freshly cut grass filling the warm afternoon air. Sweat beaded along his forehead, dampening the fabric of his navy blue tank top, but he welcomed the exhaustion. It was the kind that came from honest labor, from the satisfaction of shaping his home into something truly his. This house, this piece of land, was not just a purchase. It was proof of how far he had come. He had worked tirelessly for this. Years of service in the military had instilled in him a discipline that carried over into his civilian life, pushing him to excel in the tech industry, to climb the corporate ladder, and eventually, to buy this home in an affluent suburb of Georgia. A home he had every right to enjoy. Yet, even as he mowed his own lawn, there was an unshakable feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. A sense that he was being watched. Malik straightened, wiping his brow as his dark eyes flicked toward the house across the street. There she was, Karen Whitmore, arms crossed, lips pursed, standing on her porch with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had been watching for some time. It wasn't the first time he had caught her glaring at him, but today, there was something different about her stance, something more deliberate, as if she had been waiting for this moment. The sharp, clipped sound of her heeled sandals against the pavement cut through the air as she stepped off her porch and marched toward him. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying an edge of authority that made Malik tense. He had encountered her kind before, people who wielded their entitlement like a weapon, who saw his presence in their space as an intrusion, no matter how legitimate it was. Malik forced a polite smile, despite the irritation simmering beneath his skin. "Afternoon," he greeted, keeping his tone even neutral. Karen didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, her gaze flicked to the lawnmower, then back to him, her expression twisting into a frown. "What exactly are you doing?" Malik exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of the mower a little tighter. "I'm mowing my lawn," he replied, the emphasis on my deliberate. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face before she sniffed, arms tightening across her chest. "I highly doubt that," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "You don't live here." There it was, the accusation hidden behind feigned concern. Malik felt a prickle of heat rise along his neck, but he had learned long ago not to react, at least not in a way that would give people like her an excuse to paint him as the villain. He sighed, shifting his weight slightly. "Actually, I do," he said, his patience wearing thin. "I bought this house 3 months ago." Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line, as if the very idea of him owning property in her neighborhood was offensive. "Well," she said, tilting her chin upward, "I find that hard to believe." Malik let out a dry chuckle, incredulous. "You find it hard to believe that a black man can own a house here?" Her expression twisted in mock offense. "Oh, don't pull that card," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's not about that. It's about security. I don't know who you are, and I've never seen you before. You could be some squatter or—" Malik's jaw clenched. "Or what?" Before she could answer, she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with quick precision. Malik's stomach dropped as he realized what she was doing. "I'm calling 911, she declared, the self-righteousness in her tone making his blood boil. "We'll see if you really live here." Malik inhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain still as Karen spoke to the dispatcher, her voice adopting a panicked, breathy quality that was nothing short of theatrical. "Yes, I need the police immediately," she said, her eyes never leaving Malik. "There's a man. He's on my neighbor's property, and I don't think he belongs here." My neighbor's property. She couldn't even acknowledge that this home was his. Malik could only shake his head, his hands flexing at his sides as he fought the rising tide of anger. He had done nothing wrong. He had worked for everything he had. And yet, all it took was one phone call, one accusation from a woman like her, to turn his entire day, his entire life, into a potential threat. Minutes passed, tense and suffocating, until the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. A police cruiser pulled up in front of his house, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off Karen's smug expression. Two officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they approached. "Sir," one of them called, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Can you step away from the lawnmower?" Malik exhaled, raising his hands slightly before taking a slow step back. "I live here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I can show you my ID." Karen scoffed. "Oh, I'm sure he has some fake ID," she muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Malik bit back a sharp retort, instead reaching into his pocket and pulling out his driver's license, handing it over to the officer. The officer inspected it, then glanced at Karen. "Ma'am, this ID confirms that he does, in fact, live here." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "That can't be right," she insisted. "Are you sure?" Malik let out a bitter laugh. "Yes, Karen, they're sure." The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed with the situation. "There's no crime here," he said, handing Malik back his ID. "Next time, ma'am, please verify before calling emergency services." Karen huffed, her face a storm of barely concealed frustration. "Well, I was just being cautious," she snapped before turning on her heel and storming back toward her house. Malik shook his head, watching her retreat before letting out a long, slow breath. His fingers brushed absently against the handle of the lawnmower, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. And then he noticed something, just a few feet away, near the edge of his yard. Something metallic glinted beneath the overgrown grass. His brow furrowed as he stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look. He brushed away the dirt and roots, revealing the rusted corner of what looked like an old metal box, half buried in the soil. His fingers curled around the edge, giving it a tentative pull, but it was stuck. A strange unease coiled in his stomach. He had lived here for months. He had never noticed this before. What the hell was buried in his yard? Malik knelt beside the rusted metal box, his fingers tracing the rough, corroded edges as a deep unease settled in his chest. He had spent months mowing this lawn, walking these grounds, and yet, until now, he had never noticed the object partially buried beneath the earth. It had been hidden, forgotten, perhaps intentionally so. A strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling that this discovery was not mere coincidence, but something he was meant to find. He tightened his grip and gave the box another tug, the damp soil clinging stubbornly to its sides. With a grunt, he leaned his weight into it, and after a few forceful pulls, the box came loose with a dull, scraping sound. He set it down carefully on the trimmed grass, brushing away the dirt that still clung to its surface. The metal was worn with age, the once solid structure now brittle in places, and a simple latch held the lid shut. Taking a breath, Malik hesitated. There was something unsettling about opening something that had been hidden for so long, something that had been deliberately placed beneath the ground, out of sight and out of memory. Yet, curiosity burned within him, a need to know what lay inside, what story had been buried beneath the weight of time. He unfastened the latch and slowly lifted the lid. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound piercing the quiet of the afternoon. Inside, nestled among decayed scraps of fabric and the faint, musty scent of age, was a stack of fragile, yellowed papers. He reached for them carefully, his fingers tingling as if the ink itself still carried echoes of the past. A faded photograph slipped from between the sheets, landing face up on the grass. Malik picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. The image was worn, its edges curling, but the details were still clear. A black family stood in front of what looked like his very house. The sepia tones softened the contours of their faces, but he could see the pride in their eyes, the way the father stood tall with his arm wrapped protectively around his wife, the way the young boy at their feet clung to his mother's dress. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, a strange tug in Malik's chest as if he should know them. Swallowing, he turned his attention to the papers. The handwriting was neat but hurried in places, the ink smudged in spots as if written in distress. As he read, a heavy silence fell over him. June 12, 1963. To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, this house was supposed to be our fresh start. We came here believing we could build a life, that we could belong. But they don't want us here. They never did. First, it was the looks, the whispers. Then, the letters stuffed into our mailbox, telling us to leave while we still could. We tried to ignore it, but last night, they came to our door. They didn't wear hoods, but they didn't have to. Their message was clear. If we're still here by the end of the week, they'll make sure we regret it. We have no choice but to go. I don't know what will happen to this house, or if another family like ours will ever get the chance to live here. But if you are reading this, please don't let them erase us. Don't let them pretend we were never here. Malik's hands trembled as he reached the end of the letter. He could see it in his mind. The fear, the desperation of a family forced to abandon their home because of the color of their skin. The photograph, the words on the page, they weren't just remnants of history. They were proof of a story that had been buried, of lives that had been pushed aside and forgotten. His fingers tightened around the paper as his mind raced. Who were they? What had happened to them after they left? And why had this been buried, hidden away instead of preserved, acknowledged? His gaze drifted back to the photograph, and suddenly, realization struck him like a thunderclap. The name at the bottom of one of the legal documents, barely legible through decades of decay, Whitmore. Malik's breath hitched. He glanced instinctively toward the house across the street, where Karen had disappeared after her failed attempt to weaponize the police against him. His jaw clenched as he pieced it together. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a random discovery. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a nosy neighbor with an overinflated sense of entitlement. She was part of this history, and she had no idea what he had just found. Malik sat on his porch long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The sky now a deep shade of indigo, with only the faint hum of crickets filling the silence around him. The rusted box rested on the table beside him, its contents laid out like forgotten relics whispering a truth that had been deliberately buried. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him, intertwining with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just history. This was a thread that ran through time, through families, through this very land, and he had just pulled at it. His fingers traced the edges of the old photograph again, his eyes lingering on the boy at the bottom of the frame. A small, innocent child caught in forces far greater than he could ever understand, just like so many others who had lived through that era. Malik felt something stir inside him. Not just anger, not just sorrow, but a deep, burning need to know more. He had always known that racism had shaped the history of neighborhoods like this, that property lines had been drawn with exclusion in mind, but this wasn't an abstract injustice. This was personal. His mind drifted back to Karen, to the way she had called the police on him without hesitation. Her voice filled with the same entitlement that had driven this family from their home decades ago. And now, he had proof that her family had likely been part of that story, had stood on the other side of history, ensuring that people like him never felt welcome here. Did she know? Had she heard whispers of the past from an older generation? Or had this history been buried so deeply that even she had no idea what her own last name was tied to? A bitter chuckle escaped him as he leaned back in his chair, staring up at the dark sky. The irony wasn't lost on him. She had tried to erase him, to make him feel like he didn't belong, just as her predecessors had done to the Whitmore family before him. But this time, the truth wouldn't stay hidden. The next morning, Malik woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew he couldn't let this stay buried. He spent hours researching, digging through public records, scanning through historical archives. It was slow, frustrating work, but every document, every newspaper clipping, every legal record painted a clearer picture of what had happened. The Whitmore family had moved into this house in the early 1960s, one of the first black families to integrate this neighborhood. Their time here had been short-lived. Threats, intimidation, and systemic pressure had forced them to sell at a loss and flee. But the most damning discovery wasn't in old newspapers or deed transfers. It was in a court case from decades ago. Whitmore v. the City of Willow Creek. The lawsuit detailed how the family had tried to fight back, had attempted to hold the city accountable for failing to protect them, for allowing their lives to be threatened, for forcing them out through unofficial redlining tactics. But the case had been dismissed, buried beneath bureaucratic excuses, lost in the long history of injustices that had never been corrected. The house had changed hands several times after that, until eventually, it had landed in Malik's possession, though he had never known its history until now. His pulse quickened as he scrolled further, his eyes locking onto one detail that made his stomach tighten. The names of those who had testified against the Whitmores. There it was, in black and white: George Whitmore, a key witness for the city's defense. And listed directly beneath him, Richard Whitmore. Malik exhaled sharply. He knew that name. Richard Whitmore, Karen's father. His grip on the mouse tightened as a wave of realization crashed over him. This wasn't just coincidence. This wasn't just history repeating itself in vague, poetic ways. This was direct, generational injustice, a cycle that had never truly been broken. The same family that had played a role in driving the Whitmores out had continued to live in this neighborhood, passing down their home, their privilege, their sense of ownership over spaces that were never meant to belong to only them. And now, decades later, Karen had stood on her pristine lawn, phone in hand, calling the police on him as if history itself had never changed. Malik's hands curled into fists as he stared at the screen, the full weight of the past pressing down on him. He had moved here for a fresh start, for a sense of success and peace, believing that his presence in this space was proof of progress. But now he saw it differently. His very existence here was an act of defiance against a system that had tried to erase people like him for generations. And he wasn't going to let that erasure happen again. Malik sat at his desk, staring at the overwhelming number of documents spread out before him, each piece of paper a fragment of a larger truth, a truth that had been buried for decades. His heartbeat was steady but heavy, the weight of history pressing down on him, urging him to act. He had spent the last few days navigating public records, reaching out to legal experts, and piecing together what he now realized was more than just a personal discovery. It was a revelation that could shake the very foundations of the neighborhood he lived in. The evidence was undeniable. The Whitmore family had been systematically pushed out, their legal attempts to reclaim their rights crushed by a system designed to protect the powerful. Karen's family, in contrast, had thrived under that same system, reaping the benefits of stolen opportunities, standing on land that had once belonged to others. And now, decades later, Karen had unconsciously played out the same story, treating Malik as an outsider in a place that had, ironically, never truly belonged to her family to begin with. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Malik contacted a lawyer, a sharp and relentless civil rights attorney named Liana Brooks. She listened intently as he laid out the details, her brows furrowing deeper with every new revelation. By the time he was done speaking, she let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Malik," she said, her voice measured but firm, "this isn't just some forgotten history. This is a legal injustice that was never corrected. If what you're saying is true, and based on what I'm seeing it is, then technically this land was stolen and the city played a direct role in making that happen." Malik swallowed hard, the gravity of her words sinking in. "So what does that mean? Is there a case here?" Liana leaned forward, her eyes sharp with determination. "There's a case. It's old, it's complicated, and it's going to face resistance. But if you're willing to fight, I think we can bring this to light." And so the fight began. The news spread faster than Malik had expected. Within days of the lawsuit being filed, local media picked up the story, and soon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with whispered conversations and heated debates. Some people were supportive, their eyes filled with quiet guilt as they admitted they had never questioned the history of their community. Others, like Karen, were furious. She confronted him one evening as he stepped onto his porch, her face tight with barely contained anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Malik didn't flinch. He met her glare with an unwavering calm. "I'm uncovering the truth," he said simply. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "This is insane. That was decades ago. You think you can just rewrite history because you don't like it?" He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not rewriting history, Karen. I'm correcting it," she scoffed, folding her arms. "So what, you think you can just take this neighborhood down? Take my home? What do you even want from this? For a brief moment, Malik saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe even shame, but it was buried beneath years of entitlement and resentment. He sighed. I don't want to take anything that isn't mine, Karen, but I won't let the past stay buried just because it's inconvenient for you. The lawsuit forced a reckoning the neighborhood had long avoided. Public records were scrutinized, old city officials were questioned, and what had once been whispered rumors became undeniable facts. Interviews with elderly residents revealed the ugly truth: intimidation, threats, forced sales, and a network of exclusionary tactics that had shaped the demographic of this affluent neighborhood. Malik's case wasn't just about one house. It was about a pattern of injustice that had affected countless families like his. Some of Karen's supporters rallied behind her, convinced that Malik was stirring up trouble for the sake of it. But others, neighbors who had lived long enough to remember the stories their parents had tried to bury, began to shift. Conversations changed, perspectives softened, and little by little, the community began to confront the reality of its past. As the lawsuit progressed, Malik found himself facing a choice. Was this about legal victory, or was it about something bigger? Liana had been clear from the start. Proving direct reparations would be an uphill battle, but exposing the truth, forcing the city to acknowledge its role, could lead to policy changes that would prevent this from happening again. And Malik realized that while reclaiming his home's legacy was important, ensuring this history was never repeated mattered even more. Months passed, and the lawsuit reached a settlement. The city, under mounting pressure, formally acknowledged its past injustices, offering a public apology and committing funds to support Black homeownership initiatives. Malik's case set a precedent. While he couldn't change what had been done, he had forced the system to recognize the damage it had caused. As for Karen, she became quieter. She didn't speak to him again after their confrontation, but he could see the change in her. Whether it was resentment, reflection, or something in between, he wasn't sure. One evening, as Malik stood on his porch, looking out at the street that had tried to erase a family like his, he felt something shift. He had come here believing that success alone would be enough to claim his place in this world. But now he understood, belonging wasn't given, it was fought for. And this time, history would not be forgotten.